Welcome to Pharmacy in Focus, where I will be having pocket-sized conversations on current topics and interests relating to pharmacy and the wider health sector. My name is Shirena Vasan, bringing you Pharmacy in Focus on behalf of the Pharmaceutical Society of New Zealand. Welcome to this episode of Pharmacy in Focus. In a previous episode with Sara Hanning, we talked about her research into pharmaceutical waste in New Zealand. In this episode, we are going to delve into the disposal of cytotoxic waste. As a recap to Sara's research, her study involved 12 visits to Interwaste and determined what pharmaceutical waste was in approximately 6% of bins that were collected from Interwaste. In the study, they found 475 different products and over 75,000 units. And in that previous episode, we discussed how most of these products go through an autoclaving process to decontaminate pharmaceutical waste. But seeing as cytotoxic waste doesn't go through the same autoclaving process, we are now going to talk about, well, how is cytotoxic waste disposed of? So to start, Sara, can you give us some examples of cytotoxic medicine?
Okay, so I suppose to focus on some of the drugs that we found. So methotrexate, imatinib, capecitabine, which is a prodrug of 5-fluorouracil, and we also found 5-fluorouracil as well.
Okay.
Just to name a few.
And cytotoxic medicine is supposed to be disposed of via incineration. Can you explain the process of incineration?
That's right. Yeah. So we know that cytotoxic drugs are cytotoxic, so they're toxic to cells, and therefore there's a requirement to incinerate those. They can't just go into landfill like what we do with some of the other pharmaceutical waste stream. So they need to be incinerated, which involves sort of a high temperature, essentially burning, I suppose, the contents. And that's how a lot of countries do deal with all of their pharmaceutical waste. So in New Zealand, it's just cytotoxics that go through incineration, but a lot of countries do incinerate all of their pharmaceutical and medical waste.
Okay. So recognizing that cytotoxic medicines shouldn't go through an autoclaving process and in effect should not be in the same waste stream as the other pharmaceuticals or most of the pharmaceuticals that you found in your study, was it a surprise that you found medicines such as 5-fluorouracil and methotrexate?
Yeah, it really was. So we sort of, I suppose, intentionally didn't consider cytotoxic drugs initially in this study. We were interested, we know that cytotoxic drugs are an issue and that we need to look at more appropriate ways to sort of get rid of them, essentially. But it's not really appropriate to open up a cytotoxic bin and start looking inside, because we know that that those drugs can cause harm to humans who handle them. It doesn't just have to be via oral ingestion that they can cause harm. And so we were really surprised to see that they were in this bin where there are some sort of really clear guidelines around handling cytotoxic drugs, and so it was a surprise to see them in this waste stream, for sure.
And you also mentioned warfarin, which isn't a cytotoxic medicine. However, the recommendation is that warfarin does not be disposed of via landfill. Why is this? Yeah,
so I suppose a drug can be toxic without being necessarily cytotoxic. It can still be hazardous. And so we found warfarin in 9 of the 12 bins that we looked at, and it was ranked number 12 in terms of number of units found. So we found it in really large quantities. As you said, it's not cytotoxic, but it is a human teratogen, and it can cause toxicity when it's taken orally, sort of in overdose or inappropriately. We also know it's used as a rodenticide, so it's used to sort of rat bait, and therefore it's not something that we really want to be filtering out into the environment in any way. yeah, therefore it should really be going into another sort of waste stream. And I don't know how sort of clear the guidance is around that, but I would say that it should be treated as a cytotoxic drug when it comes to the waste aspect, at least.
Okay, so sounds like there might need to be a little bit of education around the disposal of warfarin, and that it should maybe go into the same waste bins as other cytotoxic waste. Would that be the recommendation?
Yeah, and I mean, it needs to be ingested orally, so I don't think it's such an issue for the the people handling the waste, but I think in terms of sort of downstream, I guess we don't want it to be existing in the environment. So yeah.
Sure. So we've talked about some examples of the cytotoxic medicine that you have found, and that cytotoxics need to be disposed of via incineration. However, it is illegal to incinerate cytotoxic medicine in New Zealand. Why is that? Do you know?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Yeah, so one of the sort of things with incineration is that it releases some other chemicals, I suppose. And one of the most concerning ones are dioxins. And so these are a group of environmental pollutants. They're super stable and they get absorbed by fat tissue. So once they are ingested, then they can last for a really long time. They also accumulate in the food chain. So the higher you are up in the food chain, the more you're likely to accumulate this. And they're not only a result of sort of incineration, they can be byproducts of other industrial processes too, and they can also result from natural things like forest fires and volcanic eruptions. But we know that that incineration of sort of healthcare waste is a big contributor to dioxin emissions, and that's something that we want to avoid where possible. And so that's sort of I think the background behind why incineration isn't considered an option in New Zealand. However, when it comes to cytotoxics and we need to incinerate them, that means that we need to send those drugs. So that whole cytotoxic waste stream needs to be sent offshore and incinerated somewhere else. So it becomes maybe someone else's problem. And there are ways to incinerate that minimize the release of some of these gases straight into the environment, but it's still not, it's not ideal as all waste disposal methods. It's not ideal. And yeah, on the one hand, I think it's okay that New Zealand doesn't allow incineration, but on the other hand, I think it's it's difficult to sort of swallow the fact that we then send these drugs offshore, which sort of further increases their carbon footprint as well, just through the process of actually physically sending them away.
So we can't incinerate the cytotoxics in New Zealand. You have mentioned that dioxins are environmental pollutants, so in effect toxic gases. And you've indicated it's kind of like sending our problem overseas, so to speak, because yes, we don't have those dioxins accumulating in New Zealand because we're sending them overseas. However, those gases might be increasing due to our waste in those countries. So it certainly doesn't sound like an ideal solution, but potentially the best one we've got. What countries do we send our cytotoxics to?
So we mostly send them to Australia, Germany, and France, I believe. So ever since 1992, there's been a Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movement of hazardous waste and their disposal, and this outlines basically it was developed to ensure that developed countries weren't just sending off their hazardous waste to less developed countries, and so so more developed countries potentially have more appropriate means of disposal. And so overall it suggests that hazardous waste shouldn't be disposed of, shouldn't be exported for disposal, so wherever possible should be dealt with in the country of origin. But if the country of export doesn't have that capacity, then there are sort of a series of steps that make sure that the wastes are sent off in the most sort of environmentally sound and efficient way.
Okay. So would you say that we don't have the capacity or the ability to be able to incinerate in New Zealand if it was legal?
If it was legal, then we could. I think we really need to be looking at, high temperature incineration has a really high carbon footprint, and no matter how well it handles, I suppose, some of the dioxins that result. So I think we need to really be looking at alternative ways to manage our waste, including our cytotoxic waste, that doesn't involve sending them offshore, but also doesn't involve, incineration, because the rules required to change that, I think, would be ultimately a step backwards in a time where we're trying to, look a bit more critically at sort of the carbon impact of various activities such as waste management.
Certainly. And on that note of finding an alternative, do you know of any alternatives or any research that's being done in the space?
So there's a bit of research going on. So the most exciting one, therefore the one I will talk about, is the one that I've been sort of peripherally involved with. That's happening here in New Zealand, and so there's a group of sort of engineers and anaesthetists, how it started, and they came up with a really cool way of essentially using a pressure cooker, so reasonably high temperatures, and pressure to help to deconstruct various forms of pharmaceutical waste, and deconstructing it into essentially water and organic acids in a very small mass. So it's shown a lot of sort of promise in some of the pre-tests, but we're looking at like a 1 litre vessel that needs to be upscaled substantially to be able to manage the hundreds of tons of waste that come through regularly. So absolutely there is a lot happening in this space, and some really cool things happening in New Zealand, and the proof of concept for that is showing a lot of promise, but it needs to be upscaled, and finding the funding to sort of facilitate that is the sort of current challenge.
So there's promising research happening on a small scale, but the funding is kind of the limiting factor right now.
Yeah, and one of the challenges identifying who should be paying for this sort of thing, the management of pharmaceutical waste, who owns that problem, so to speak. Yeah, and that's something that's sort of being worked through, whether should it be the government, should it be the manufacturer, should it be individuals? It's a public health issue, but one that that I suppose everyone really needs to take some responsibility for.
Indeed. And have you had some conversations with manufacturing companies, and do they support the more efficient and safe disposal of cytotoxic medicine?
Yeah, absolutely. We have been in conversations with some local manufacturers, and they're really keen to get on board with this kind of technology and implement it within their own sort of at the manufacturing side of pharmaceuticals. And internationally, there's a really big drive to try and reduce the carbon footprint through all phases of pharmaceutics, right from sort of research and development right through to sort of the end stage. I suppose the pharmaceutical waste that results when people don't need their medicines any longer. And so it is a space that there's some things happening, but it's yet to sort of I suppose converge together into something really meaningful.
Sure. So it sounds like there's a lot more that could be done in this space, but you're certainly well on your way, along with your engineering researchers and anaesthetist colleagues as well. Yeah,
we really hope so.
Well, thank you so much for your time again, Sara. It has been really useful to learn about your findings in the study, how pharmaceutical waste is disposed of both in New Zealand and in the case of cytotoxic waste overseas, and why we're sending that particular waste overseas, and also looking at what research is being done right here in New Zealand and how that could potentially have a better impact on the future, and reduce the environmental impact of pharmaceutical waste and landfill. So thank you very much, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Great, thank you.